What is up, my trunk slaying friends? We're going to talk about projects. Before we get into it, I apologize. The video lighting is shit. I wasn't planning to record a video this morning, so I wasn't prepared, and the sun's ruining everything. But this post on Reddit was too good to not respond to. So, thank you, OP, for an excellent post on projects. Alright, so let's get into it. This is a post here on Reddit. How do other MSPs schedule professional services work? And there were 5 questions asked. And we're going to kind of talk about some of this, because I do see this come up quite a bit on here, but also a little bit more esoterically. I want to talk about projects at MSPs and why I think so many of you struggle to do them properly, kind of out of nowhere. So, first of all, let's define what we're talking about. So there's 3 primary business units or buckets of revenue that also have corresponding profit center that the average MSP is going to have in terms of rendering their services. We have managed services, technical services, and professional services. Managed services is, of course, your recurring all-you-can-eat revenue, and if you're an MSP, it's in your name, managed service provider, and it should account for the bulk of what you're doing. Technical services is your block, retainer, break fix. It's your unscoped, ad hoc, bill per interaction labor, which hopefully you don't have a lot of. And then finally, professional services is your scoped project labor. So these are your projects that you're executing where you have gone ahead of time and defined a scope, regardless of if you're charging upfront, billing as you go, billing on completion, whatever your billing model is, you've delivered a scope that you're going to hold yourself to. And so we're talking today about that scope project labor. And right away, if you hear me saying that and you say, I don't scope my projects, well, there's your first problem. And you don't have to watch the rest of the video. Go scope your projects. But frequently what I see is that and I'm wearing my trunk slaying hat for a reason. When most MSPs start and it's just the founder, you're usually actually pretty good at delivering, small or maybe even larger projects, because the project management component isn't really a hurdle you have to overcome, because 100% of the project management variables, accountability, and authority live within your head, because it's you. You are the project manager and the project salesperson and the project scoper and the procurement individual and the installer and the account manager. It's just you. So most MSPs do tend to start off doing project work because that is an easier methodology to learn how to sell and bill. People want a thing done. I can do the thing. Here is a scope of work for the thing that I'll execute. And somewhere along the way, as we start to get more employees in the mix, almost every single MSP I've ever met goes from being able to execute projects relatively efficiently to being pretty embarrassingly terrible about it. Especially when we compare the MSPs to other industries that do project work as their main line of business, which is pretty much every single trade and service industry. MSPs are horrible at executing projects. And why does that happen? And what I like here is I think the poster here really broke down with their questions a lot of the core reasons why most of us go almost just one of us from being pretty decent at doing projects to projects just being a big convoluted mess. And the thing is, I've not met anybody, myself included, who has not struggled to figure out how to make this work once there's more than just me doing it. So it's not just you. And let's talk about that. So the thing that got me started originally, the OP basically explains the basic things that we would expect. That this person's clearly trying to do project management. They're having difficulties balancing between meeting client needs, optimizing technician time, maintaining profitability. I think those are common things. I don't think you will ever not have those challenges, ever. So if you're performing a project management role at your MSP, there's no magical light at the end of the tunnel where you're going to graduate beyond having those challenges. It's just about how you approach them. And your method of approach will change as the way you deliver projects changes. But what really got me going here was this sentence about the biggest issue for us is that a lot of professional services work is very start-stop and infrequently start to finish for many reasons. So blocking calendars out and scheduling services falls flat. That right away is a red flag that tells me that we are not approaching projects with the right mindset. And then we get into some of the questions here, which I'll read off quickly. How do you typically schedule professional services work? Do you use specific tools or software to help streamline the scheduling process? What factors do you consider when prioritizing and allocating resources for different projects? How do you handle urgent or unexpected requests while maintaining existing commitments? And any tips or best practices you found particularly effective in managing professional services scheduling? And I think those questions all kind of sum up a lot of the common challenges. So let's go through this and see if we can't give a little bit more clarity and just some ideas to kind of shake the tree a little bit and help you on a path to having your better arms around your project. First, just general suggestion I would make to anybody is you should have one way that you bill for your projects. And I have opinions on what the right way is, and I'll make another video on that. But for now, you should just have one way that you bill for all of your projects. You need to be able to standardize on that because it is going to have an impact how you do everything else. And whether that means you're billing upfront and full, you're doing phase billing, you're doing progress billing, you're doing billing on milestones, you're doing billing when you complete the project, whatever. You need to just pick a system, and now every project that comes from this point forward is billed that way. I don't care what your clients say. And a lot of executing projects, and this is where I think a lot of you are struggling, a lot of executing projects properly is once the scope of work is agreed to, it doesn't matter what the client says. And you have to understand that. This is different. This is different from transactional support. You've agreed to a recipe with a deliverable. You cannot deviate from that once the project starts. We'll get into in a minute about a change order process. Projects are, if you're one of those MSPs that has that the customer is always right mentality and I have to deliver great service, this is going to be hard for you because this is the one element of your MSP we have to stop saying that. Because no, they're not. They're explicitly 1000% not right. And you cannot midway deviate, change, move around, scramble, uproot, or upend things because the client has now come to you with some, heretofore unmentioned scope change that they want added to the project. It's very, very important that you approach your projects with this mindset, and we'll get into why in a second. The first question, how do you typically schedule professional services work within your MSP, and do you use any specific tools, which is the second question. Well, I mean, not to be cheeky, this is what your PSA is for. And a frequent excuse I hear from people who have, and forgive me if this is you, who have literally no idea what the fuck they're talking about, will say that their PSA does not have the necessary things they need to schedule a project. Well, first of all, if you went to school like I did and you got a degree in engineering management or some type of engineering and you understand how to read a Gantt chart and you've been professionally trained how to manage projects, okay, fine. I'll agree with you that a lot of MSP tools are not, engineering management tools. But that's literally probably 5% of you. And if that's you, and you went into an MSP tool expecting it to be on the same level as a full-blown construction site management tool, you're an idiot. And so this is a common theme I see where people blame their tools. Your tools aren't failing you. You have no idea how to use them. You're failing your tools. So I've yet to meet a PSA that doesn't have a project management module that isn't fit for purpose to get through an MSP project. And I've never encountered an MSP project, and I've worked at a very big MSP that was too out of scale for the project management section of the ticketing system to work. That is 1000%. You don't know what you're doing, not your tool. So hopefully anybody who had their hand raised that was about to say that the project management module of whatever tool they're using is crap has put their hand down and is a little bit embarrassed in their chair. So moving forward from that, the answer to the first two questions is your PSA, you should be using your PSA to do all of this. This is where you should be scheduling everything to begin with. It does contain enough tools to keep a project organized, to keep project milestones going, to do scheduling. Odds are you're not using it right, like we just talked about. And it may not be that 5% in the room, people who think they're smarter than everybody. You might just not be using it right because you never learned that module. That's typically what I find is the case for most MSPs that have more than a few employees. When you first got started, you really needed a ticketing system that you could bill from. And it was just you, or maybe you and one or two other people. And like we said at the beginning, the project management and executing and scoping and selling and account management was one person. So you didn't really need the project modules. You probably never used it. And then by the time your business grew to the point where you need it, there's a good chance that literally no one on your team has any idea how to use it. It was never set up, or if it was set up wrong. So spend some real time being a little bit humble, acknowledging that fact, and go back to the learning resources that your PSA has provided you and start from scratch setting up your project module correctly to the stage of the business you're currently in, not however it came out of the box or what you did 10 years ago when you first got your PSA and you had no idea what you were doing. So the third question was, what factors do you consider when prioritizing and allocating resources for different projects? And so this is one of those questions very easy to brush off. It's like, well, what factors do I consider? Or, what resources do I need to execute the project? What kind of question is that? But I actually think it's a really good question because it is a question most of us brush off. We just sort of say, the project team, they'll do it, right? And the project team may be a person. It may be multiple people. It might just be the owner still. But whatever the case, we tend to brush that off because it's the person who's most capable of doing stuff. And that is the reality we live in. But I think that also factors into the approach a lot of us take is we think of projects as either being something we're going to have the help desk do, or we need basically the most experienced person in our team to do. I thought that way, and a lot of MSPs I know thought that way or still think that way. That's why a lot of us struggle and think that we can't really do certain projects because we don't have the person on staff who can execute them. And one day we had this light bulb moment. A number of years ago, we were working with C-Level and on going through how we were going to do project billing. And in going through setting up the project billing, one of the things that the C-Level coach went over with me was that I was thinking about billing the wrong way. I wasn't thinking about it from the perspective of the finance admin. I was thinking about it from the perspective of me, Dean, the operations manager. And that caused me to start wondering if I was doing that with the entirety of the project. And the spoiler is yes, it was. So the single biggest thing we did with our MSP was we started thinking about ease of repeatability and schedulability in our projects, not focusing on the technical acumen of the executed final product. And once we started changing our mindset to thinking about the ease of repeatability and schedulability, two things happened. Our projects became a lot easier for us to have most of the work done by a lower level person. And suddenly I didn't really need a highly qualified project manager to run most of the project. I could actually hand it off to a dispatcher. So the change that we made there, and what I recommend that you start doing, is we went in and we thought about, instead of who has to do what in the project, which was something we always struggled with because this entire industry struggles with that. And we all know this because my level 2 isn't going to be able to do what your level 2 does, and your level 1 could be more qualified than my level 1. It's all nonsense in our space. So instead we went with something that everybody understands. Where does the work have to be done? And what I found from doing that was most projects, the bulk of the project can be done before it gets installed at the client's site. And there's very, very minimal things that actually need to be done at the client's site for most projects. And before you interrupt me and yell at your screen, yes, even for cabling and infrastructure projects, a good portion of that can be done before you go to the client's site. And so what I would challenge you all to do is to start thinking critically about, and I mean this for everything, even cloud projects. If you think of the client as having a physical location or in the case of a cloud project, a physical location off in the sky with the clouds. How much of the project can't be done? Or let me rephrase that. How much of the project can you do before you actually have to be there? And if you think critically about it, you're going to realize it almost all of it. So what this will do for you is if you start thinking about, well, let's talk about like a physical project. So I don't know, like a server or a firewall or something, or switching equipment, something like that. First thing you got to do is you got to get all the equipment. You got to collect all the equipment. You need to stage all the equipment. If you're shipping the equipment directly to your client's site, other than very specific markets where transporting of gear is a challenge, probably don't do that. And because of opportunity cost, and also because shit walks off site. And if you've done projects at a larger scale or in other industries, you know that. But you need to stage all your gear. You need to unbox your gear. It's a trivial step, right? But it's not. You need to have an unboxing policy. What do you do when you unbox your gear? Where does the packing materials go? How long do you save it for in case you need to return it? What happens to all the accessories and manuals? Are you one of those shops that just throws all that shit out? Because if you do, you're stupid. You're an idiot if you throw all that stuff out. Because I know why you're throwing it out. Because you're thinking it's either, I don't need this, I know better, or I can look it up later. No, you can't. No, you can't. So do you have a policy around that? How do you label everything? Because you are labeling everything before it leaves your building, right? No? Interesting. That would explain why you need a very high level person to install it. So you're right there is a whole section of the project, just how you approach unboxing. Then you have basically somewhere you need to set the gear up and do any sort of gear prep. So if it's a server and for some reason you are one of those people that enjoys pain and suffering and sells out of your own pocket and tried to save the client a couple of bucks by ordering some server component outside from the manufacturer, and now you're going to install it in your shop and void the warranty, which is a jackass thing to do. And once again, if you're doing that, I don't know why you think that's a good move. It's not a good move. Just buy it configured properly from the vendor to begin with. And if your client can't afford it, then you scoped it wrong. Like, you guys get that, right? Like, I'll make another video on that. But like with scoping a project, your goal here isn't to put together what your client can pay for. It's to put together the right solution for their business problem. And if they can't afford that solution, then the problem isn't actually worth solving, because all business problems should be tied back to revenue. So if they don't have enough revenue to offset the problem, it means the problem isn't costing them enough money, which means that they can't afford to fix it. Everyone understand that? So you have a process for configuring your hardware at your location. In the case of, UPSs and battery backups, that could simply be staging the batteries in them. That could be attaching ears to all of your switches before you get on site. And there's a reason for that, and we'll get into that in a second. But it's doing as much of the physical prep work as possible on site. You should have some sort of configuration or testing bench or deployment bench where you're setting up all of the gear ahead of time and trying to do as much of the initial configuration in-house as possible. And once again, before your hands start going up and you tell me, oh, I can't configure this remotely from my site. Sure you can. Either you're not thinking creatively enough about how to do it, or you don't know what you're doing. And that's fine if you don't know what you're doing, but just like I said with the tools, don't blame the tools because you don't know what you're doing. You can configure almost anything from your site. You ever heard of a VPN? A VPN's a magical way. You can connect a segregated part of your office LAN to the client's LAN, which is usually the main reason why I hear people claim they can't configure things on site. You get as much of the gear configured as possible on site, following hopefully a standardized SOP, which is exactly the SOP you follow every time. And you have this whole initial phase of the project that's all stuff that has to be done at your office that doesn't require client input. Guess who I have to depend on for scheduling that? No one. Because I don't have to coordinate getting access to anything. I don't have to really coordinate around any of my project assumptions. I don't really have to coordinate anything with end users at the client because that's not deployed. It's not in situation yet. So that allows me to get as much of it as possible before it goes there ready. And if you look at any industry that does standardized or custom projects, this is usually how it works. And if they don't do it this way, they charge you a lot more. And you want an example of this? Anyone ever have kitchen cabinets installed? Well, if they're building them for you at your house, that costs like 5x as much. Because guess who? It's less expensive for everybody if they build them ahead of time in their shop and bring them to your site. Weird how that works, how other industries figured that out, but yet we're too smart to understand that. So you have this phase where you get as much done in your office as possible. This phase should not be interrupted by any of the things OP mentioned about having start-stop, infrequent start to finish, coordinating with the client. Who gives a shit? You just get it done. And the thing is, a lot of that in-office work does not need to be done by a high-level project person. If I have clearly defined SOPs on this is how we unbox and label things, we put our manuals into Ziploc baggies that we attach to the equipment to be brought on site. We collect all the accessories, we put those in labeled baggies. Everything is accounted for, staged, neatly arranged, ready to go in the staging area. I don't need a T3 that I'm paying, $95K a year to do that. I could probably pull somebody off the help desk on a day we have spare capacity to follow that. And if you're there and you're saying, no, I couldn't trust my lower level people to do that, well, that's a whole separate set of issues to unpack. But who are you hiring? So the bulk of the project is everything I just described. You do at your office. Then you should have an on-site installation phase. And this should be a very, very short phase because your highest opportunity cost thing you can do at an MSP is leave the building and go to a client's site. One of the things that's going to be critical to you having this idea that your projects and overall your service work is going to be executed efficiently and within your control is you need to adopt a mentality of, I never go on site. You are going to have to go on site. So I'm not literally saying you won't, but you need to approach every situation with how do I avoid rolling a truck? And for those of you that say I deliver most of my value when I roll my truck because I'm in front of my clients, no, you don't. No, you don't. You're not a trunk slammer anymore. Stop talking like one. If your clients need to see you doing the work to value you doing the work, you failed at doing the work. And I gave this example in a previous video, and I'll summarize it very shortly here. If I hire a lawn care company and I need to watch them cut my lawn to feel comfortable that I've gotten value out of hiring them to pay them, they have expressly and objectively failed as a lawn care company because what you're paying them for is a nicely manicured, weed-free lawn that is taken care of, not a babysitting service. And so if you think that most of the value at your MSP is added by going there and doing stuff in front of your client, there is value to that. But if you think most of your value is doing that, you have your gears crossed. That's probably why your projects aren't profitable. So you need to approach rolling a truck with this sense of, I shouldn't be doing this. I need to be here for the least amount of time possible to execute this properly and efficiently. And I need to spend as little time on site as possible while still delivering a really good experience. It will force you to think about efficiency. You're still going to go on site. You're still going to talk to the client. You're still going to do stuff in front of the client. And we could do a whole video on the sort of theatrics that you should be going through when you're doing work on site, because they do add value. It's just not your primary value add. So going on site really should just be to rack the gear and leave. And I think this is the second area where a lot of MSPs fail with their projects because they come into the on-site phase and they combined installing the gear with final configuration, QC, testing, and deployment to the end users. And they try to make that whole thing one phase. And you're shooting yourself in the foot by doing that for a variety of reasons. The first one being that, well, it's the day you install it, oftentimes it's not ready to be released for testing to the users. But secondly, is the person who can install the gear the right person to run the QC? And can they do that most efficiently by running around with their head cut off at the client's site? And if you're saying yes, well, then you're probably a copier dealer. And for some reason, you stumbled onto RMSP when you should be on RMPS. And I'm sorry you got this far in the video, but that's the only person that I know of that thinks it's a value add to come on site with their gear and spend all day running around like an idiot. So if you are an MSP and not an MPS, then really your on-site experience should be fairly tight to coordinate. I need access to the building, I need access to where the gear is going, and I may need limited access to coordinate downtime, especially in the case of infrastructure projects. And if you think about this from a client standpoint, if that's how you approach it, rather than we're going to be on site for the next 3 days and we may have to take the network up and down, versus, hey, I need to come on site for 2 hours on a Tuesday or Thursday, and the next 3 weeks, for those 2 hours, you will be down, but then you'll be back up, and then we'll finish remotely configuring everything in the following days without interrupting, your entire site. One of those sounds a lot more mature, a lot more specific, and a lot more value add than the other. And so this helps you overall with communicating the value and the sense of project management to your client. Here's the other thing. If on site, all you really need is somebody who can rack the gear, get it plugged in physically to whatever it has to get plugged into, and then get it turned on to the point where operational functionality is restored, that probably, once again, isn't your highest level resource. I'm not advocating you send out a T1 brand new person, but that's probably a mid-level resource that can do that. And so if I'm looking at this from a scheduling standpoint, that frees up a lot of resource opportunities for me. I could send the project person, but I could also send a field tech. I could send one of our T2 guys. I could send a really experienced, help desk member who understands this stuff and has a great relationship with the client. I have a lot more scheduling options now, and because I'm scheduling for a defined series of tasks that have defined deliverables and outcomes, it's a lot easier to communicate that to the client, and also it was in your scope of work and listed in your project assumptions. And some of you are going to be saying, well, what about something like where we're, migrating from point A to point B? I can't install the new domain controller alongside the old one and turn it on and have restored functionality. I'm not saying you have a completed project. I'm simply saying that the client's ability to work is no longer interrupted. That's a finite thing. You should be able to quantify how long. Think of it this way. Getting a toilet installed, the plumber should be able to tell me how long the water needs to be turned off for. It shouldn't be, we're going to need to turn the water off and on at our discretion to troubleshoot for the next 3 days. That's an asshole. I don't want that person as my plumber. I want somebody who can say, yep, we're almost at the point where we need to turn your water off, and it's going to be off for about 30 minutes. We'll turn it. If we run into a problem, we're going to kill it at the toilet, and we'll turn your water back on for the house, and we'll reconvene and let you know what we're going to do. And of course, you are approaching your MSP projects like that, right? You're not forcing the client to be down and offline while you tinker with arriving at the finished result, because, well, that would make you an asshole, and you're not an asshole, right? So you've gone on site, you've deployed the gear, you've done any additional labeling, which is super important, and a lot of you don't do this, and I know this because I go into a lot of your sites and I see that nothing is labeled. You need to label stuff for the next guy, and you need to assume the next guy doesn't know who you are and doesn't speak the same language as you do. Everything should be labeled MSPs. Doesn't really have to do with the OP here. This is just a Dean tangent. Label all your shit. From to labeling on all your cables. Label in English what every box does. I don't understand why people are so allergic to this concept. Charge for the labeling time. Like, it's a billable service. Label everything. Everything gets labeled. We all have lived somewhere in a house, apartment, where the electrician did a amazing job labeling stuff in the breaker box, and we love it because we know that the breaker that says smoke detectors turns off the smoke detectors, not the garage door opener and 2 lights on the 3rd floor. So label stuff appropriately and be very, very generous with your labeling. Everyone will appreciate it. And if you are one of those MSPs that's very big on what the client can see as part of our value add, Well, there you go, jackass. Label everything. The client can see that. And when they open the closet door and they see not only how nicely managed all the wires are, but how wonderfully, beautifully, and clearly labeled everything is, they're going to say, hey, boy, did these people do a good job. There's no excuse not to. So at this point, probably the bulk of the project has been executed. And you're really probably at that point where you need to now schedule a cutover date and do testing. And those are the parts of the project that normally have the least amount of certainty, because we have to coordinate these with the clients and individual users, and stuff's not going to work right, and we need to go back and QC it. But this should be at the very end of the project. Like 70 to 90% of the project is done. And if you approach it this way, then that means that you're really only in that scramble, uncertainty period for the tail end of the project, and the client should know that. And so it makes it a lot easier for you, going back to your scope of work, which we talked about at the beginning, to kind of put some pressure on the client at that point and leave the ball in their court. Because at this point you can be like, everything that we could do without you has been done. We've moved the project as far forward as we can, like we agreed to, without you, client. Now we need you. And as we agreed to in our project assumptions and our scope of work, you are going to provide me with X, Y, and Z. I have availability at these times next week. Do any of those work for you? And you notice that when I talk about scheduling, I keep mentioning that I'm telling the client when we have availability, because guess what I don't give a shit about? When they have availability. And it's not because I'm a jerk, it's because it goes back to, we're trying to execute a previously agreed upon scope of work, and I am the professional services vendor. I'm not the house help that, is there at the client's beck and call. You have to approach projects with that mindset, the same way that your doctor or your lawyer or your CPA approaches working with you. Here is when I, the professional, have availability within the agreed upon timeline to execute your project. You agreed with me, client, that you would be available. Please pick a date. You've now put the onus of scheduling on the client. And if the client says none of those dates work for me, okay, I apologize. I thought we had a clear timeline here and we're on the same page. I can't move these phases forward until you're able to give me some of your time. And those are the times that I have available. Would you like to push the project out by another week? See how easy that is? And then the client can either say yes or no. And you can repeat that over and over and over again. And at a certain point, hopefully and this goes back to billing methods, why I have a preferred billing method. Hopefully, if you build in one of the methods where you've already collected payment, what do I care at that point? If the client keeps pushing back the date, you just have to make sure that you don't start accepting the responsibility and accountability for the date being pushed out, because your accountability was a project plan, which the client has opted to deviate from. Guys, see how that works? I generally find that when we get to that point where we should be coordinating a cutover, doing testing, is typically around the point when scope creep will happen. So I was going to talk about this. Scope creep will happen that our morality as service providers generally acquiesces us to say yes to. I think that to compare the project to something else a little bit more silly, we're all sitting down for Thanksgiving dinner and the dog comes over and begs for food during the official turkey carving and the main part of the dinner. Of course, we're all going to say, no, we're not going to feed you from the table. We don't feed the dog table scraps when they're begging during Thanksgiving dinner. But once Thanksgiving initial part breaks down, people clear their plates, they go back for seconds. Once that initial bout of organization has kind of passed by, it's far more likely, if the dog's still begging, that someone's going to sneak them some food. Because at that point, you start to feel bad. You feel like you made them wait this long, you made them follow the process, and gosh golly gee, they were so good about it until this point. Can't I just give them something? So, generally speaking, this is when we're most likely to say yes to scope creep in a project, is after we get to the point of testing and cutover. And it would be an easy video if I just said, say no to scope creep, but, well, you're running a business, and at the end of the day, even if you have followed my advice and you've taken sort of a relatively firm approach to the entire project, that you're not going to just deviate to the client's whims, at this point you feel like I can see the goalpost, I'm almost there, how much could it hurt? Boy, oh boy, let me tell you, that is the beginning of the unfucking. That is when the project goes off the rails, you lose control, all of the goodwill you've built up by being organized goes out the window, your profitability goes out the window, and the likelihood the client's going to be happy with you no matter what you do also goes out the window, which is why it is incredibly important that you have some sort of change control and scope management policy defined, and you have to be a little bit of a jerk about it. I'm not saying literally that you be toxic about it, but you do have to be a little uncomfortably firm about following your policy, because it is the only token you have at this point in the project to keep things from going off the rails and being blamed for it, when almost 100% of the time when a project goes off the rails at this point, it's because the client has introduced a change. On that note, quickly, one of the points of scoping a project is it is your job as the professional, and you are the professional, to fully understand the problems the project is solving. And you should account for variables, and you should have a section in your scope that lists assumptions. If you are having trouble clearly articulating assumptions, variables, and making sure that the project reasonably accounts for them, and you get to the end of the project and things aren't working, and then the client wants to make changes to make them work, that's your fault. That is the MSP's fault. You're the professional, you scoped it wrong. I'll go back to silly examples I think we can all agree with. If I'm having a sprinkler system installed and it's supposed to take 3 days, and on the second day they come to me and they say, we don't have enough pipe, we're gonna have to order more pipe and come back, that's their fault. Now, I may be on the hook to pay for the additional material, but the project, first of all, I'm not gonna be happy about that, but the project now being off schedule, out of scope, taking longer, requiring more holes to be dug, more parts, the sprinkler system company did a shit job scoping it. That's their fault. And so if I've agreed to a scope of work with the client and the client hasn't changed any variables, and during the course of executing the project, I uncover something that I didn't scope properly, that's not the fault of the client or the environment. That's my fault. Even in situations where we all know over a beer that was the client's fault because they didn't tell you about something, it's still your fault. That's still a discovery failure, even if the discovery failure happened because the client literally lied to you. It's your fault. And in the case of that sprinkler example, if I said to the sprinkler guys, oh yeah, the back of my yard is all sand, I filled it in with sand 5 years ago, you should have no problem digging there, and they take me at my word for that, and then they get there and they go to dig into that sand and it's all rocks, that's their fault, not my fault. Even though I misled them, that's their fault. And that's what assumptions are for in a project. So this is why it's important in your scope of work that you not only have a change order or change of scope policy, you need to list project assumptions. These are things that you or the client or both of you are reasonably assuming based on whatever you've discussed, and it's basically both parties saying we're not gonna fully discover and plan out every variable for this area. So we're both assuming it will work. It is super important you define your assumptions, and if you run into a problem with them, that you have a conversation as quickly as possible with the principals at the client about the fact that you both made a mistake in your assumptions, and here are the steps to rectify it. Do not wait until you get to the end of a cutover or a QC phase to go to the client and be like, sorry client, I know we assumed that we'd have the right licensing and that you would have all the cows, but you didn't. That's not when you do that, because at that point, it's your fault. Very quickly on the subject of assumptions, some common things in case you've never done this before, and I would suggest that you Google and look up basic project management so you can learn how to do project assumptions. But things like, for example, that access will be available on the day of the install at the site. That's an assumption. Electricity will be provided. Functional internet will exist. Those are all assumptions. I don't control electricity and internet. The client may not control it either. We're just assuming they will be present. You're assuming, maybe the client has a ton of vendors and they just never did a good job tracking all of their vendor support agreements. And for whatever reason, you don't want to do a proper discovery and discover if every single line of business software that exists has a support agreement, which you should be doing, but you're lazy. You don't want to do it. That could be an assumption that, hey, we did not do a discovery in all your line of business software. We are going to assume that you have a valid support agreement with anything you're asking us to configure and deploy. If you don't, we're off the hook. It's an assumption. Assumptions are important because you go over them before you sign and agree to the project, because the client could say, well, hang on a minute. No, go do that in your discovery. Okay, I'll go do that in my discovery, or we do have it, or we don't have it. It's very important you have those assumptions in place. So this brings me over to, I kind of already answered, but it's really number 4 question OP asks is, how do you handle urgent or unexpected requests while maintaining existing commitments? And I think they mean 2 things by this, so I'm going to answer both of them. So the first one, explicitly in the project, there is no such thing as urgent and unexpected on a project. Full stop. Doesn't exist. It can't exist. An emergency is something you react to. You cannot have a planned emergency. A project, by definition, is scoped and therefore planned. So you cannot have an emergency as a part of executing the project. If you create an emergency during the project, like, I don't know, you drill through a wall mounting a rack and you puncture a hole in the pressurized pipe and water is spraying everywhere, then you react to that emergency. But urgent and unexpected requests aren't a thing during a project. So should you have a plan to deal with them? Sure, you should have an E&O policy, and hopefully don't hire or put people in a position where they're going to do things that would create an emergency you have to react to, and plan better. But as to what your change of work process is for and what your assumptions are for, I'm assuming that we have clear access to that wall to mount equipment. And the client could say, well, hang on, what do you mean you're assuming? Well, I don't know. I'm not a construction person. Could you have somebody from facilities on site the day of? And so I'll give you a great example around that. You know how I avoided that? We ain't mounting shit to the wall. I want somebody from your team to go mount a piece of 3/4 inch or 1 inch plywood to the studs in this location. I will spec it out with them before we get the project started. I'm happy to meet with them on site. They screw it, we're screwing into that. There you go. And our assumption is the plywood will be provided and will be mounted appropriately. That's how you fix things like that with assumptions. But anyways, if you're talking more about during the course of the project, something is uncovered that changes the scope of the project, that's not an emergency and that's not urgent. And you have to once again approach the project like that, because only 2 reasons that could have happened. You did a bad job scoping, which we just talked about, or the client added a new variable. If you did a bad job scoping, well, that's your fault. And so you're fixing it probably out of your own pocket. That damn sure shouldn't be an emergency or urgent for the client. So once again, you shouldn't be worrying about how you're going to manage that within the project. You solve that problem with your credit card, and don't make that mistake again. And for most of us, that's going to be around licensing or scoping hardware, like drive capacity, shit like that. Like, you made a mistake, you didn't scope a physical thing properly, it's not the right thing, and now you got to buy another one. In some cases, maybe you can get your client to pay for the difference. But like I talked about with the sprinkler company coming here and saying, oh shit, we messed up, we don't have enough pipe. I think it's reasonable for them to ask me to pay for the pipe. It's not reasonable for them to ask me to cover any sense of urgency or scheduling conflict that makes for them. If they need to come back again an extra day and they're like, sorry, we have another job we have to go to. Well, sucks to be you guys. Guess you're paying overtime because that was your fault. So from that sense, there really is no defined concept of an emergency or an unexpected request when it's your fault. And if it's the client, Well, my friends, this is what a scope change policy is for. Because if a client comes to you during the project and they go, oh yeah, by the way, we need to have all of this done tomorrow. Well, but the scope of work for the project said we had 60 days to do it. And with this, 2 weeks from now, we're the phase where it's a cutover. What are you talking about? Well, you have to have that conversation with the client. The client is not the captain when it comes to executing a project. And as I said at the beginning of this video, there are 0 examples of professionally executed projects on earth that you can show me where the client is in charge of the schedule and the deliverables like that. It's not how it works. So if the client changes a variable, you have to pull out your scope change policy. And everything in the scope change policy gets solved with at least 2 things: money and time, hopefully both, because the client has changed the recipe and the plan, and they don't get to do that without repercussions. And I'm not saying this like the client is bad and your enemy, but this is how you manage a project. This is why a lot of you think your project modules don't work right, because you're not managing your projects properly, and you want your project modules to do things that no project management software is meant to do. It's not how we manage projects. So if you have an unexpected change or request come up that the client gives to you, you say, hopefully, no problem, we'll take a look at that. We're happy to try and accommodate or customize this. You go take a look at what they want. You then say, hey, yeah, we can do that for you. Here is the scope change document I need you to fill out that now shows the items we are adding, the additional cost that's going to be, and the hit to the timeline. And if the client says, what do you mean that's going to cost more and take longer? That's when you look at the client with your surprised Pikachu face a little theatrically, and you pull up the original scope of work and you say, see how this wasn't in the scope of work we both agreed to and signed that had a timeline and a budget? Happy to make these changes for you, but we didn't account for them originally. And we know clients do this all the time because clients don't understand our line of business. And a lot of times with the sort of after the fact changes, that's what's happening. And so I know I've said that you need to take a very hard line here. It doesn't mean you need to turn this into an antagonistic relationship. You can have some understanding for the fact that your clients don't get it. How many times have any of you ever had any sort of a workman at your residence and you've said something to the effect of, hey, while you're here, can you? Because in our minds, we're thinking the trip out here, bringing all your tools and materials clearly takes you time and effort. You're already here. You won't have to come back. I don't think this will take that long. Can you just add it on? And the thing is, that's kind of rude to do as a client, but we've all done it or at least thought it. And a lot of times that's what your clients are thinking. They're thinking, well, while you're here, either literally or sort of figuratively while you're here working on this, can't you just do X, Y, Z? Because they have no idea what it takes to execute the project. They don't know if that thing is trivial or not. They don't know if that's going to require you to go back and change all your documentation. They don't know if it was spec for that. They don't know. And so you can't just assume they did know all of that and asked you intelligently and say yes to it. You have to have a change of work process where you explicitly state that's not what we agreed to. I am happy to look into it. Here's how we could execute on it. Here's what it will cost to you. Here's how long it will take additionally, or how it will impact the project. And if the client isn't okay with the consequence of that change, you don't make the change. It's literally not your problem to make that change. It's not in the scope of work. If you want to see an industry that aggravatingly enough does this really well, are government contractors around RFPs. It's a great example. It's not in the RFP. It's not in the scope of work. I'm not doing it. And I know sometimes that leads to ridiculous stuff, whereas the general public, we stand there scratching our heads being like, what the hell? Like, you got the guys, you got the shovels, why aren't you doing the thing? That's why, because that's proper project management. So the other part to that question that I want to touch on quickly, I think that in some MSPs, large and small, the other way that question could be interpreted is I have a finite amount of resources that are available to work on the project, and I have these reactive issues that have nothing to do with the project that keep taking their time away from the project. What do I do about that? sucks to be you. You suffer. That's your fault. And I don't mean it's your fault like you intentionally put yourself in that position, but if you don't have enough capacity to handle your emergencies on your reactive help desk and execute your projects, then you're over capacity and shouldn't have agreed to the project. And I know that's a very flippant answer to give, but that's the truth. Like, that's not the client's problem. And that's not really a project management issue. That's a deeper issue at your MSP. My sort of off-the-cuff snarky answer would be, why is your project person touching reactive help desk issues? What's wrong with you? But I understand that in a lot of MSPs, the project person is unfortunately an integral part of other parts of the business. They wear multiple hats. And just quite simply, if you haven't built the fact that client A having an emergency could pull the project resource off the project for client B into your project plan, that's your fault. And you should be embarrassed about that and learn a lesson and not do it next time. And that is an important component here, is knowing when to say no to things that you don't have the capacity for them. A big challenge I had at my MSP as we refined our project process, especially when we're still owner-led sales, was saying to the owner, you can't sell that right now. And nobody wants to hear that, because they want to sell things while, you know, the deal is warm, while the iron is hot. But you do have to sometimes come back and help them understand that reality, that, like, we have a lot going on our help desk. I need those resources reactively for other things. I cannot guarantee you they'll be able to dedicate to this project, and I'm definitely not going to go in front of the client and apologize. So unless you're willing to agree that you're going to handle 100% of the egg on face yourself, then no, we can't commit to that. It's going to happen. The fire is hot. Don't touch the stove lesson. You're just going to have to learn that by getting burned. So this is kind of a long video. I want to wrap it up. So just finishing off with just any sort of general tips or best practices. I think I already covered a bunch of stuff. I'm happy to record additional videos on any individual subject if anybody has any questions. The single biggest thing I can kind of toss out there that I talked about at the very beginning of the video, I'll come back to as a final tip. You should have one way that you bill for projects. And this shouldn't be a trivial off-the-cuff decision that you decide on. You really should build your project delivery model around your billing method. I prefer billing for everything up front for a few reasons. It forces you to really do a tight job with scoping. You have to be able to communicate the value of the project up front without the theatrics of showing them that you're executing it. And it removes a lot of the margin for error for your team to sort of be like, geez, didn't realize this was going to take another 10 hours. So I guess we got to bill another 10 hours. It really does make the MSP 100% accountable for the project going off the rails. But also it allows you to, first of all, collect all your revenue up front, which is nice. Doesn't mean it's profit yet. It's like a gift card. You have to recognize the revenue as you work through the project, which can be a little tricky for some people to do. But also, if your whole project is framed around a tight scope of work that you paid for up front, equipment and labor 100% in advance, and you build a culture around being able to deliver to that profitably, it opens up some other doors for you that are really helpful, especially leasing and housing, which you explicitly can't do if you're not billing up front. So leasing and housing are amazing tools to help. Remember we said at the beginning that if a client doesn't have the revenue to offset the business problem, then they can't afford to solve the business problem, so you shouldn't be doing the project to begin with. Well, that's different if it's a monthly payment, isn't it? So that opens up the opportunity, if you're able to properly scope, assign the value to, and charge in full upfront for your projects. Well, now the clients who can't afford revenue-wise to solve that business problem suddenly can. And that's an incredibly powerful tool for stack alignment. And a lot of your clients that would otherwise be good clients, except for the fact that maybe their network is shit, or their server is old, or they don't have your edge device, whatever it is that's creating other service delivery frustrations, it's a lot easier to overcome them if you change that CapEx to an OpEx, which you really can only do if you can calculate the price of the project up front. So as just a general tip, if you can find a way to see yourself to being able to fully scope, price out, communicate the value, and sell the entirety of the project up front, I think you'll find that opens a lot of doors later. But That doesn't mean that's the only way or the right way. There are plenty of shops that do progress billing or billing after completion that have amazing project departments that are very profitable and very well run. So there are absolutely other ways to bill, but that'd be my tip. I hope you all have a great Thursday. Projects are one of those things that I think a lot of MSPs don't put the attention they need to into them because it's always I'll get to it next year thing. And if I leave you with one final thought, we went from roughly a $500,000 MSP to over $50 million MSP over a relatively short time span, like a decade. And there was a variety of reasons around that, but one of the things we waited way too long to do was to get our arms around making our project standardized and efficient, because we kept saying that's not our core line of business, we'll do it next year. So if you are listening to this video and that sounds like you, don't wait. The problem doesn't get easier as you get bigger. So, some problems get easier as you get bigger. This isn't one of them. As soon as you have a staff member that is not you, the owner, that is either going to be the primary executor of, scoper of, or manager of a project, that's probably at the point where you should say, all right, I need to get a process in place here. And yeah, you'll change your process later and you'll refine it later, but don't keep putting it off as something that you'll do next year. It can be a huge limiting factor to your growth later. And this is really important, projects can be a really, really, really important tool for boosting your valuation in a short term if you are thinking of doing anything in terms of selling your MSP, merging your, anything where the valuation of your MSP is important. Yes, your MSP will be mostly valued on your recurring revenue that you have protected by contracts, but if you're able, in anticipation of an event like that, to go in and over 6 months do a bunch of highly profitable project work that results in cash on hand that you've generated, that's a really, really, really powerful tool that you can use very tactically. So don't wait and save projects to be next year's problem. Have a good one, everybody.